Hello, 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 and welcome to the beginning of the Lucky Starr series. I'm going to start with reading the preface and then get into the first chapter. Alright, let's get started. Preface. Back in the 1950s, I wrote a series of 6 daring-do novels about David Lucky Starr and his battles against malefactors from the solar system. Each of the 6 took place in a different region of the system, and in each case I made use of the astronomical facts as they were then known. David Starr, Space Ranger, was written in 1951, and at that time there was still a faint possibility that there were canals on Mars, as had first been reported 3/4 of a century earlier. There was, therefore, a faint possibility that intelligent life existed there, or had existed at one time. Since then, though, we have sent probes past Mars and around it to take photographs of its surface and map the entire planet. In 1976, we even landed small laboratories on the Martian surface to test the soil. There are no canals. There are, instead, craters, giant volcanoes, and enormous canyons. The atmosphere is only 1% as dense as Earth's and is almost entirely carbon dioxide. There is no clear sign of any life at all upon Mars, and the possibility of advanced life upon it, now or ever at all, seems nil. If I had written the book today, I would have had to adjust the plot to take all this into account. I hope my gentle readers enjoy the book anyway, as an adventure story, but please don't forget that the adventures of science can outdate even the most conscientious science fiction writer, and that my astronomical descriptions are no longer accurate in all respects. Isaac Asimov. Chapter 1. The Plume from Mars. David Starr was staring right at the man, so he saw it happen. He saw him die. David had been waiting patiently for Dr. Henry, and in the meantime enjoying the atmosphere of International City's newest restaurant. This was to be his first real celebration now that he had obtained his degree and qualified for full membership in the Council of Science. He did not mind waiting. The Café Supreme still glistened from the freshly applied chromosilicon paints. The subdued light that spread evenly over the entire dining room had no visible source. At the wall end of David's table was the small, self-glowing cube which contained a tiny 3-dimensional replica of the band whose music filled in the soft background. The leader's baton was a half-inch flash of motion, and of course the tabletop itself was of the Senito type, the ultimate in force-field modernity, and, except for the deliberate flicker, quite invisible. David's calm brown eyes swept the other tables, half hidden in their alcoves, not out of boredom, but because people interested him more than any of the scientific gadgetry that the Café Supreme could gather. Television and force fields were wonders 10 years before, yet were already accepted by all. People, on the other hand, did not change, but even now, 10,000 years after the pyramids were built and 5,000 years after the first atomic bomb had exploded, they were still the insoluble mystery and unfaded wonder. There was a young girl in a pretty gown laughing gently with the man who sat opposite her, a middle-aged man in uncomfortable holiday clothing, punching the menu combination on the mechanical waiter, while his wife and 2 children watched gravely. 2 businessmen talking animatedly over their dessert. And it was as David's glance flickered over the businessmen that it happened. One of them, face congesting with blood, moved convulsively and attempted to rise. The other, crying out, stretched out an arm in a vague gesture of help, but the first had already collapsed in his seat and was beginning to slide under the table. David had risen to his feet at the first sign of disturbance, and now his long legs ate the distance between the tables in 3 quick strides. He was in the booth, and at a touch of his finger on the electronic contact near the high television cube. A violet curtain with fluorescent designs swept across the open end of the alcove. It would attract no attention. Many diners preferred to take advantage of that sort of privacy. The sick man's companion only now found his voice. He said, "Manning is ill. It's some sort of seizure. Are you a doctor?" David's voice was calm and level. It carried assurance. He said, "Now sit quietly and make no noise. We'll have the manager here and what can be done will be done." He had his hands on the sick man, lifting him as though he were a rag doll, although the man was heavy set. He pushed the table as far to one side as possible, his fingers separated uncannily by an inch of force field as he gripped it. He laid the man on the seat, loosening the mango seams of his blouse, and began applying artificial respiration. David had no illusion as to the possibility of recovery. He knew the symptoms, the sudden flushing, the loss of voice and breath, the few minutes' fight for life, and then the end. The curtain brushed aside. With admirable dispatch the manager had answered the emergency signal, which David had tapped even before he had left his own table. The manager was a short, plump man, dressed in black, tightly fitting clothing of conservative cut. His face was disturbed. "Did someone in this wing—" He seemed to shrink in upon himself as his eyes took in the sight. The surviving diner was speaking with hysterical rapidity. "We were having dinner when my friend had the seizure. As for this other man, I don't know who he is." David abandoned his futile attempts at revival. He brushed his thick brown hair off his forehead. He said, "You are the manager?" "I am Oliver Gasper, manager of the Café Supreme," said the plump man bewilderedly. "The emergency call from table 87 sounds, and when I come it's empty. I am told a young man has run into the booth of table 94, and I follow and I find this." He turned. "I shall call the house doctor." David said, "One moment. There's no use in that. This man is dead." "What?" cried the other diner. He lunged forward, crying, "Manning!" David Starr pulled him back, pinning him against the unseeable table-top. "Easy, man. You can't help him, and there's no time for noise." "No, no," Gaspir agreed rapidly. "We must not upset the other diners. But see here, sir, a doctor must still examine this poor man to decide the cause of death. I can allow no irregularities in my restaurant." "I am sorry, Mr. Gaspir, but I forbid the examination of this man by anyone at the moment." "What are you talking about? This man dies of a heart attack." "Please, let us have cooperation and not useless discussion. What is your name, sir?" The living diner said dully, "Eugene Forrester." "Well then, Mr. Forrester, I want to know exactly what you and your companion ate just now." "Sir!" The little manager stared at David with eyes swelling out of their sockets. "Are you suggesting that something in the food caused this?" "I'm not making suggestions. I'm asking questions." "You have no right to ask questions. Who are you? You are nobody. I demand that a doctor examine this poor man." "Mr. Gaspir, this is Council of Science business." David bared the inner surface of his wrist, curling the flexible metallite sleeve above it. For a moment it was merely exposed skin, and then an oval spot darkened and turned black. Within it little yellow grains of light danced and flickered in the familiar patterns of the Big Dipper and of Orion. The manager's lips trembled. The Council of Science was not an official government agency, but its members were nearly above the government. He said, "I'm sorry, sir." "No apologies are necessary. Now, Mr. Forrester, will you answer my first question?" Forrester muttered, "We had the special dinner number 3. "Both of you?" "That's right." David said, "Were there no substitutions on either part?" He had studied the menu at his own table. The Café Supreme featured extraterrestrial delicacies, but the special dinner number 3 was one of the more ordinary meals native to Earth. Vegetable soup, veal chops, baked potatoes, peas, ice cream, and coffee. "Yes, there was a substitution." Forrester's brows drew together. "Manning ordered stew marplums for dessert." "And you didn't?" "No." "And where are the marplums now?" David had eaten them himself. They were plums grown in the vast Martian greenhouses, juicy and pitless, with a faint cinnamon flavor superimposed on their fruitiness. Forrester said, "He ate them. What do you suppose?" "About how soon before he collapsed?" "Oh, about 5 minutes, I think. We hadn't even finished our coffee." The man was turning sickly pale. "Were they poisoned?" David did not answer. He turned to the manager. "What about the marplums?" "There's nothing wrong with them, nothing." Gaspir seized the curtains of the alcove and shook them in his passion, but did not forget to speak in the softest of whispers. "They were a fresh shipment from Mars, government tested and approved. We have served hundreds of portions in the last 3 nights alone. Nothing like this has happened till now." "Just the same, you had better give orders to eliminate marplums from the list of desserts until we can inspect them again. And now, in case it wasn't the marplums at all, please bring me a carton of some sort and we will transfer what is left of the dinner for study." "Immediately, immediately! And, of course, speak to no one of this." The manager returned in a few moments, smearing his brow with a feathery handkerchief. He said, "I cannot understand it, I really cannot." David stowed the usual plastic dishes, with scraps of food still adhering to them, in the carton, added what was left of the toasted rolls, recapped the waxed cups in which the coffee had been served, and put them aside. Gaspir left off, rubbing his hands frantically to reach a finger toward the contact at the edge of the table. David's hands moved quickly, and the manager was startled to find his wrist imprisoned. "But, sir, the crumbs!" "I'll take those, too." He used his penknife to collect each scrap, its sharp steel sliding easily along the nothingness of the force field. David himself doubted the worth of force field tabletops. Their sheer transparency was anything but conducive to relaxation. The sight of dishes and cutlery resting on nothing could not help but leave diners tense, so that the field had been put deliberately out of phase to induce continual interference sparkles that gave rise to an illusion of substance. In restaurants they were popular, since at the conclusion of a meal it was necessary only to extend the force field a fraction of an inch to destroy whatever adhering crumbs and drops remained. It was only when David had concluded his collection that he allowed Gaspir to perform the extension, removing the safety catch first by the touch of a finger, and then permitting Gaspir to use his special key. A new, absolutely clean surface was instantly presented. "And now, just a moment." David glanced at the metal face of his wrist watch, then flicked a corner of the curtain aside. He said softly, "Dr. Henry." The lanky, middle-aged man who was sitting on what had been David's seat 15 minutes earlier stiffened and looked about him with surprise. David was smiling. "Here I am." He put a finger to his lips. Dr. Henry rose. His clothes hung loosely upon him, and his thinning gray hair was combed carefully over a bald spot. He said, "My dear David, are you here already? I thought you were late. But is anything wrong?" David's smile had been short-lived. He said, "It's another one." Dr. Henry stepped within the curtain, looked at the dead man, and muttered, "Dear me." "That's one way of putting it," said David. "I think," said Dr. Henry, removing his glasses and playing the mild force beam of his pencil cleaner over the lens before replacing them, "I think we had better close down the restaurant." Gaspir opened and closed his mouth soundlessly like a fish. Finally he said in a strangled gasp, "Close the restaurant? It has only been open a week. It'll be ruin, absolute ruin." "Oh, but only for an hour or so. We'll have to remove the body and inspect your kitchens. Surely you want us to remove the stigma of food poisoning if we can, and surely it would be even less convenient for you to have us make arrangements for this in the presence of the diners." "Very well, then, I will see that the restaurant is made available to you, but I must have an hour's grace to allow present diners to finish their meals. I hope there will be no publicity." "None, I assure you." Dr. Henry's lined face was a mask of worry. "David, will you call Council Hall and ask to speak to Conway? We have a procedure for such cases. He will know what to do." "Must I stay?" put in Forrester suddenly. "I feel sick." "Who is this, David?" asked Dr. Henry. The dead man dinner companion. His name is Forrester." "Oh, then I'm afraid, Mr. Forrester, you will have to be sick here." The restaurant was cold and repulsive in its emptiness. Silent operatives had come and gone. Efficiently they had gone through the kitchens atom by atom. Now only Dr. Henry and David Starr remained. They sat in an empty alcove. There were no lights, and the tri-televisions on each table were simply dead cubes of glass. Dr. Henry shook his head. "We will learn nothing, I am sure of that from experience. I am sorry, David, this is not the proper celebration we had planned." "Plenty of time for celebration later. You mentioned in your letters these cases of food poisoning, so I was prepared. Still, I wasn't aware of this intense secrecy which seems necessary. I might have been more discreet if I had known. No, it is of no use. We cannot hide this trouble forever. Little by little there'll be tiny leaks. People see other people die while eating, then hear of still other cases, always while they're eating. It is bad and will grow worse. Well, we will talk more of this tomorrow, when you talk to Conway himself. Wait." David looked deep into the older man's eyes. "There is something that worries you more than death of a man or the death of 1,000. Something, I don't know. What is it?" Dr. Henry sighed. "I'm afraid, David, that Earth is in great danger. Most of the Council does not believe it, and Conway's only half convinced. But I am certain that this supposed food poisoning is a clever and brutal attempt at seizing control of Earth's economic life and government. And so far, David, there is no hint as to who is behind the threat, and exactly how it is being accomplished. The Council of Science is entirely helpless." And thus ends Chapter 1. I hope you've enjoyed, and it looks like Asimov and all his universes are very fond of mysteries. Hooray, I say. Okay. Hope you're all having a fantastic Saturday. Bye!